Here to talk about all of this is John Halterwanger. He is he's a politics reporter for Insider and specializes on national security and foreign policy. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
John, first talk about how this sort of conflict compares to previous Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, specifically in Gaza. It feels like this time around, as opposed to 5 or 6 years ago, has been heavier, with the exception of Israeli troops actually not being on the ground in Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the bloodiest fighting we've seen since 2014, and we're honestly seeing a lot of the same tactics used this time around as that Israel used in 2014, in terms of using airstrikes to level buildings, level entire apartment buildings and residential buildings, and using similar justifications as they did in 2014, saying that, well, Hamas is using human shields here, so that justifies us taking out these large 13-story buildings. We saw over the weekend, of course, that became especially controversial when Israel's conducted an airstrike that took down a building containing offices for AP and Al Jazeera, two very prominent media outlets. So we're seeing a lot of very similar tactics here. The death toll is mounting, and it's very unclear when the fighting will stop, as Netanyahu just hours ago seemed to rebuff Biden's calls for de-escalation by saying that the offensive would continue until they accomplish the aim of it. And he was not very clear on what that is at this time.
One of the aims of progressive Democrats is to try to get Biden to be perhaps a fairer arbiter of the conflict. It seems like Biden has given essentially a free hand to Netanyahu, at least until now. Tell me a little bit about the divide you're seeing among Democrats over how Joe Biden has handled this.
Yeah, well, we definitely seem to be at an inflection point in terms of U.S.-Israeli relations. We're seeing a growing number of progressive Democrats step up and criticize Biden essentially for not taking a more nuanced approach to this conflict, for continuing talking points that we might have heard from presidents, 10, 20 years ago, defending Israel's right to self-defense without expressing much concern for Palestinians or the broader conditions that have facilitated this conflict: the occupation of Palestinian territories, the evictions in East Jerusalem that you spoke of earlier. So there's a big push for Biden to speak more on these matters, to uphold his pledge to have a foreign policy that is centered on human rights. Many progressives like Rashid Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez have said that Biden's approach to this thus far has really undermined his pledge to center his foreign policy on human rights. And it's really putting Biden in a tough position. He came into this renewed violence pretty unprepared. He doesn't have an ambassador in Israel. There's no consulate in Jerusalem. There's no means of communication with the Palestinian side either, at least on the ground. So he has progressives criticizing him. He has really nobody. They did send an envoy, I should say, there to help deal with the situation, but doesn't have a senior diplomat there on the ground. And it's very interesting to watch this develop in Washington and see Biden be pushed into the corner. Initially, the administration was very wary of publicly embracing a ceasefire in any form. They have blocked several statements in the UN Security Council aimed at condemning the violence in Gaza and pushing for a ceasefire. Finally, on Monday, Biden said he supports a ceasefire. He wasn't very imminent with his phrasing of that. And today, he stepped it up slightly by saying he would like to see a de-escalation of tensions today.
The politics of all this are fascinating because clearly Joe Biden is worried about Jewish voters who overwhelmingly support Democrats. And yet it almost feels like, based on the polling that I've seen over the last couple of years, most Jewish voters, most Democratic Jewish voters actually don't support some of the policies of the Likud government by Netanyahu. They don't support the settlements in the disputed territories. They don't support the heavy-handed approach towards Palestinians, treating them as second-class citizens. So is Joe Biden making something of perhaps a political miscalculation as he tries to figure out where to come down if it's a purely political decision for him driven by U.S. domestic politics?
The case could definitely be made for that. Obviously, the conversation on Israel in the U.S. has changed, where people, prominent politicians, are less afraid to step up and say, hey, we have some very real concerns about the way the Israeli military is conducting itself in these conflicts with Hamas. We have some very real concerns about the Israeli occupation and the general treatment of Palestinians. We have AOC echoing reports from top human rights groups like Human Rights Watch that have said that Israel's treatment of Palestinians essentially amounts to a form of apartheid. And I think that is also translating into Democratic voters changing their views on this. It's kind of a reflexive process at the moment where people are saying, okay, maybe we can re-examine this. They're not as afraid of kind of one of the knee-jerk responses to criticism on Israel in the past was basically allegations of anti-Semitism. People have begun to reject that. In many ways, I think Senator Bernie Sanders played a large role in that as someone who is Jewish, who had many families die in the Holocaust, and who lived in Israel. He stepped up about 5 years ago and criticized Israel over its what he described as disproportionate use of force in 2014. And we've really seen a major shift in the conversation since then.
And speaking of shifts, I mean, for so long, Americans have simply viewed Israel as, oh, they're our best friend in the Middle East. They're the only true democracy. And yet, to really, truly be a democracy, Israel would have to, of course, include the Palestinians. In order to do that, Israel would cease to be the Jewish state that it wants to be. So it's as if Israel has a choice. It can either be a Jewish supreme sort of state, or it can be a democracy in which the Jewishness would be diluted because of the Palestinian populations. But it seems like Americans aren't ready, perhaps like Israelis, to try to make that choice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Biden administration is using talking points on the peace process that are 20 years old. It needs to come up, it seems like, with a new paradigm to really address the realities on the ground, that a two-state solution is incredibly far from happening. That's the main U.S. goal and has been for years. The Trump administration didn't really take that approach, given their policy largely slanted towards favoring Netanyahu's government and its policies. So, yeah, absolutely. In the U.S., Biden is really struggling to come up with a coherent approach to this at present, an approach that actually matches what's happening on the ground, and an approach that matches the political discourse on the Israel-Palestine conflict in Washington. He seems to be operating as if it's still the 90s, but things have changed since then.
And one of the changes, of course, is that in the 90s, of course, Israel actually occupied Gaza. They got out. And the Israeli allegation is that the Palestinians, led by Hamas, then made a mess of Gaza and turned it essentially into a terror base. Israel, in response, has essentially turned Gaza, with its 2.5 million Palestinians, into an open-air prison. There's a blockade. It's enforced by Israel. It's enforced by Egypt. And so you have these humanitarian disasters whenever there are conflicts. Is there more that the United States could be doing specifically to help in terms of providing more humanitarian relief and perhaps pressuring the Israelis to ease up on the bombing so that people who have lost power, who have lost food, who have lost their homes can be helped?
Well, there's a major push right now for Biden to consider conditioning military aid to Israel, to the $3.8 billion per year that the United States gives to Israel in military aid. There's been legislation introduced to that effect within the past few months. And today, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Mark Pocan and Rashida Tlaib introduced a resolution to block a $735 million sale of precision-guided weapons to Israel. So there's a huge push for that, for Biden to recognize that the U.S. has a major influence over Israel purely through the amount of funds that we give them every single year, and for him to consider the fact that if you sit down at the table with Netanyahu and you say, hey, look, the money might dry up if you don't change things, that could have an influence. And that is really a major push that we're seeing in Washington right now from everyone from prominent senators like Senator Bernie Sanders to younger progressive Democrats like AOC.
And the irony is that in Israel, there's some Israelis, at least on the right, who say, you know what, if the United States doesn't want to give us weapons, then so be it. We'll do it ourselves. We're just fine. What's the relationship like right now as far as Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden? I mean, Netanyahu was obviously very close to Donald Trump because Donald Trump's very strong pro-Israel support and essentially looking the other way at whatever Israel was doing. And Netanyahu clearly wanted Donald Trump to be reelected. But what's the sort of relationship that exists between Netanyahu and Biden?
Well, it's publicly cordial. They're reiterating many of the same talking points that we see all the time. As Netanyahu basically rebuffed Biden's calls for de-escalation today by saying the offensive would continue, he also thanked the Biden administration for maintaining Israel's right to self-defense. But clearly, Biden is struggling to have an influence over the Israeli leader. He called for de-escalation, and Netanyahu essentially, without saying it directly to Biden, said, no, we're going to continue to move forward with the operation. So it's friendly in public. It does seem that the Biden administration is trying to take a more private approach to pushing Israel towards a ceasefire, but we're not really seeing results so far. And a lot of civilians on both sides are suffering on the ground.
Yeah, and John, I'm with you. I do think that there needs to be some sort of a paradigm shift. I mean, Israelis refer to this, the conflict in Gaza, as essentially mowing the lawn, that every now and then they have to trim back Hamas in Gaza and people have to die. But that doesn't really solve the existential problem for both sides. I mean, there has to be some new way of looking at how Israel, and largely a lot of Americans too, who are in these occupied territories, who are the settlers who are in areas that are disputed. But in any case, John Halterwanger, he is the politics reporter who focuses on national security and foreign policy for Insider. John, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Got it.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.